The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal and inhumane system that forcibly transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans to work as slaves on sugar plantations in Cape Verde and the Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. Spain and Portugal established colonies in the New World in around 1500, initially enslaving local indigenous people. However, as European diseases and violence took a toll on native populations, they increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. By the 17th century, Britain, France, and Holland also established colonies in the New World, relying on African slave labour. The triangular trade emerged. European ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, exchanged them for enslaved people, and then transported these captives across the Atlantic to the Americas. What was the effect of this? Africans were spread all around the American continent with a loss of identity. Let's not forget that African Americans now have unequal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities that continue to affect their lives today. This video will unpack the transatlantic slave trade and how it impacted African Americans. The transatlantic slave trade commenced during the 15th century when Portugal and subsequently other European kingdoms were finally able to expand overseas and reach Africa. These European kingdoms were motivated by imperialism, power, and capitalism, and were looking to become as powerful as possible to compete with each other. The Portuguese initially began kidnapping people from the west coast of Africa and enslaving them, transporting them back to Europe. The Portuguese also established commercial relations with West and Central African leaders who agreed to sell slaves in exchange for European goods. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as enslaved labourers on the sugar plantations in Cape Verde. Spanish conquistadors also took and enslaved Africans to the Caribbean after the year 1502. However, Portuguese merchants continued to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half, operating from their bases in Congo, Angola, alongside the west coast of Africa. By the 1600s, English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa. In 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people with the Spanish colonies. Before the creation of the United States of America, Britain had established colonies in the north. British America consisted of 13 colonies who enslaved African Americans. These African Americans were regarded and treated as property with little to no rights. In many colonies, enslaved people could not testify in a court of law, own guns, gather in large groups, or even go out at night. These policies were the worst in the southern states, with enslaved people being expected to work from sun up to sundown. However, they may have been given Sundays off to tend to their own small gardens. As property, slaves were frequently bought and sold, and sometimes family groups were divided across plantations or even colonies, with some slave owners maybe keeping the families together as a safeguard against slaves running away. Slaves of many households often lived in the kitchen or a small outbuilding, while slaves on larger plantations often lived together in a quarter or a group of quarters with an overseer. Religion, storytelling, music, and dancing were important parts of the enslaved person's life and could help share and preserve the African cultural traditions across generations. However, British America was dominated by Protestant Christianity, and many Africans were culturally dominated by it. The death toll of the transatlantic slave trade was staggering. Many enslaved Africans perished during the brutal journey across the Atlantic from Africa, which was known as the Middle Passage. The slave decks itself was a living nightmare. To the slave traders, these human beings were cargo, and slave ships were especially designed to transport as many captives as possible, with little regard for their either health or humanity. Slave decks were often only a few feet high, and the African captives were shackled together, lying down side by side, head to foot, or even closer. Slavery was abolished on January 31st, 1865, but to this day, the damage from the African American slave trade still lives on. As a result of the slave trade, there are currently 51.5 million people of African descent in North America, and approximately 66 million in South America, and 1.9 million in Central America. This has contributed to African families being torn apart because there were large economic incentives for warlords and tribes to engage in the slave trade. Another consequence was that Africa experienced more and more corruption and lawlessness. This is connected to the vast depopulation and continuing fear of captivity, which made economic and agricultural development almost impossible in many parts of Western Africa. Economic activity in Africa was significantly hindered following the vast number of Africans being sold into slavery across the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, economic activity traveled through the economies of the European kingdoms in America and not the African nations. This allowed the European empires to continue spending on technological advancement and military to ensure that they were more powerful than their neighbors. The transatlantic slave trade caused immense disruption to African societies, tearing families apart and uprooting entire communities. Enslaved Africans endured the brutal Middle Passage, losing their identity and roots. Loss of identity remains a lasting trauma for many African Americans. This is a big reason why Black Americans are arrested at 2.6 times the per capita rate of all other Americans, and this ratio is even higher for murder and robbery. This is because slavery in the slave trade has contributed to lower levels of education, lower levels of wealth, and for that reason, a bigger reason for African Americans to commit crime. African American slaves could not own property, and they were very unlikely to be able to climb in socioeconomic status. This pushed the African American population towards crime for economic reasons. This has also grown into a broader sociocultural phenomenon for African Americans. After all, slavery only ended in 1865, and Jim Crow segregation laws were still in place up until 1964, which really was not that long ago. So of course, the transatlantic slave trade played a crucial role in the social destruction of African Americans. The point here is that historical injustices transcend into the contemporary world, with different people beginning life with different opportunities and starting positions. This does not mean that African Americans are predetermined to fail, but there are structural disadvantages that African Americans experience that most people would not. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing and liking the video for more content like this.